The cupboard smelled of old wood and mildew and Dudley's discarded football boots, and Harry lay in it with his eyes open, listening to the house wake up around him. He could tell the time by sound. First came the groaning of the water pipes, deep in the walls, a sound like something thinking, then Aunt Petunia's footsteps on the landing, light and purposeful, already planning the day. Then the long creak of Dudley's bedroom door, then the enormous, rhythmic complaint of the staircase as Dudley descended, testing each step to its structural limit. Harry had memorized it over 10 years of listening from the dark. He could have conducted it. He sat up, angling sideways to avoid the shelf where Vernon kept his golf equipment. He was 10 years old and already too tall for the cupboard where the staircase pressed lowest. Nobody had mentioned this. He pulled on Dudley's old grey t-shirt, 2 sizes too large, collar stretched to a permanent V, and Dudley's old jeans, which he had to belt with a piece of rope because none of Dudley's actual belts worked on him. Then he went to collect the post. This was one of Harry's jobs. There were many. The post, the weeding, the washing up. He had stopped wondering why these were his and not Dudley's. It was simply the shape of things at number 4, Privet Drive. The cupboard, his bedroom. Dudley's second room, a toy room. There were people in the house who were served, and there was Harry. The post lay on the mat inside the front door. 3 envelopes and a garden furniture catalogue. Harry picked them up and turned toward the kitchen, and that was when he saw it. Not the stamp, not the paper, though it was thicker than the Dursleys' usual post, cream-coloured and slightly rough at the edges. What stopped him was the address, written in green ink in a looping hand, unlike anything in the house. Mr. H. Potter. The cupboard under the stairs. 4 Privet Drive. Little whinging. Surrey. He read it again, then a third time, more slowly. The cupboard under the stairs. Someone had written that. Someone had looked at number 4, Privet Drive, and known precisely where Harry lived. Not the house, not the door number, but the room, the specific, accurate, unambiguous fact of it. Harry stood very still in the hallway and read the address 3 times, and each time it said the same thing. He was still reading it when Vernon came around the kitchen door. "Give me those." Harry handed them over. The thick cream envelope disappeared into Vernon's dressing-gown pocket, and the look on his uncle's face was not the red flush he got at bureaucratic inconvenience or the baffled squint for malfunctioning technology. Something quieter and harder, the look of a man completing a task he had been waiting for. Harry went to make breakfast and did not say anything. That night, when Dudley's snoring had reached its deepest register and the house gone still, Harry eased the cupboard door open, centimetre by centimetre, and slipped into the dark hallway. Vernon's study. The letter was on the desk under a glass paperweight, still sealed, as though refusing to open it could make its contents not exist. Harry moved the paperweight. He unfolded it in the pale yellow light of the street lamp and read. Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Headmaster, Albus Dumbledore. Order of Merlin, First Class, Grand Sork, Chef Warlock, Supreme Mugwump, International Confed of Wizards. Dear Mr. Potter, we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Please find enclosed a list of all necessary books and supplies. Term begins on 1st September. We await your owl by no later than 31st July. Yours sincerely, Minerva McGonagall. Deputy Headmistress. He read it twice, then read the supply list, then read the letter once more. He didn't understand most of the titles on the letterhead. Chief Warlock meant nothing to him. Supreme Mugwump, International Confederation of Wizards. But he understood the shape of them, the shape of genuine authority, of someone permitted to put it in writing. A deputy headmistress had signed her name. There was an enclosed list of materials, a term start date, a deadline for reply. This was an institution. Institutions had addresses, and people at the top were responsible for what they sent. An envelope addressed to the cupboard under the stairs. Someone had looked at number 4, Privet Drive, and written to the fact of it, not what the Dursleys told the neighbours, not what school records said, but where Harry actually slept, precisely and without euphemism. Whoever sent this letter wrote to where people were. That seemed to Harry like the beginning of something important. He folded the letter and tucked it, along with the supply list, into the inner pocket of his jacket. He left the empty envelope on the desk where he had found it. Then he went back to the cupboard and packed a bag in the dark. £8.43 saved from change on errands, a biscuit from the kitchen tin, a spare jumper. He had been out before without anyone noticing. He left number 4 at 2:40 in the morning, pulling the front door shut behind him with both hands so the latch would not click. The train from Little Whinging reached London just as the sky was going the colour of old pewter, the summer light still thin and cool. Harry sat in the corner of a near-empty carriage with the letter on his lap. The headmaster of this school had more titles than anyone Harry had encountered in a document. Official things, licenses, planning permission, lived in London. The letter expected his owl, which he didn't have, but an institution had written to him, acknowledged his existence by address, and signed its name. He walked out of Paddington and turned south. He found it by watching. He had been on Whitehall for nearly half an hour when he saw the woman. She was walking quickly in long purple robes, and no one on the pavement was looking at her. Not the man in the suit, not the woman with the pushchair. A man stepped around her without glancing up from his newspaper. Harry watched her step into a red telephone box and not come out. He crossed the street. The box was entirely ordinary. Faded red paint, a directory on a chain, a coin slot. He stepped in. He picked up the receiver. Dial tone. He thought about the word magic and what letters were where on the buttons and pressed 62442. "Welcome to the Ministry of Magic," said a woman's pleasant recorded voice. "Please state your name and the nature of your business." "Harry Potter," he said. His voice came out steadier than he expected. "I have a letter I need to show to whoever is in charge of the law." There was a soft, mechanical clunk. A badge slid out of the coin return slot. Harry Potter. Visitor, in neat black type. The floor of the telephone box juddered, and then, smoothly, with a low hum, it descended. The atrium was vast and gold-lit, the ceiling too high to make out clearly, lined with fireplaces through which people were appearing and disappearing in both directions. A fountain in the centre caught the light. Harry stood very still when he emerged from the visitor's booth and made a quiet, internal adjustment to everything he thought he knew about the world. The security wizard at the desk looked up. He went through stages Harry had seen Vernon go through with the unexpected. A beat, then narrowing eyes, then the slow recalibration. Small boy, enormous clothes. No adult in sight. "I need to speak to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement," Harry said. "I need to report something. Please." He was directed to the lifts. The lift was brass and latticed, and went up a very long way. The corridor on the DMLE level was quiet. Harry walked its full length with the letter folded in his fist, reading each plaque. Aura Headquarters. Improper use of magic office. Misuse of Muggle artifacts. He stopped at the door at the end of the hall. Head of Department. He knocked. "Enter," said a voice from inside, loud and clear, with the quality of someone accustomed to being heard in large rooms. Harry went in. The office held filing cabinets and stacked folders, and a row of memo papers folded into the shapes of birds, perched along a shelf with their heads tilted. Behind the desk sat a witch, broad-shouldered, square-jawed, with very short grey hair and a monocle on a chain. She was looking at him the way a person looks at the unexpected, when they have already decided not to dismiss it. Harry crossed the room. He set the letter down on the desk. He pressed his hand flat on the envelope, fingers spread, so she could read the address without picking it up. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at him. Her expression didn't change. He thought that was probably the most promising thing that had happened to him all day. She had been reading the morning memos when the boy came in, and her first thought, before the envelope, before his name, before anything else, was about the clothes. Not dirty. Clean enough. But they were the clothes of a much larger child worn by a much smaller one. A grey t-shirt, collar stretched to a permanent V, trousers that pooled at the ankle, shoes that were too large, laces done in double knots, a grey jumper tied around the waist in case of cold. The clothes were borrowed from someone who had not shared them willingly. He crossed her office without being invited, placed an envelope on her desk, and pressed his palm flat on it, fingers spread, so she could see the address before she opened anything. She looked. Mr. H. Potter. The cupboard under the stairs. 4. Privet Drive. Little Whinging. Surrey. She read it once. She read it twice. She set her monocle straight. Your name, she said. Harry Potter. His voice was steady. That registered too. Amelia Susan Bones had spent 31 years in this department. She had conducted death notifications, inquest proceedings, interviews with grieving parents, and accused killers and survivors of things she didn't describe at dinner tables. She had learned to receive information without showing what it had done to her. She received this information. How did you get here? She said. He told her. She did not interrupt. The letter in the post. He collected the post. That was his job. He had various jobs. And he had seen the address before his uncle's hand closed over it. His uncle's face. Not surprised, he was careful to note, but deliberate. Vernon Dursley had known a letter was coming. The study that night. The household asleep. The letter on the desk under a glass paperweight, still sealed. The street lamp light through the window, and Harry reading it by that. What did you make of it? She asked. I didn't understand most of the titles on the letterhead. But it was signed. There was a list of materials, a term date, and a deadline. I thought, this is an official school. Official things have people in charge of them. Official people are in London. So you came to London. I came to Whitehall, he said, with the precision of someone to whom specificity had been necessary for a long time. I didn't know where the ministry was, but I thought it would be near the other official things. And the phone booth. I worked out the number. You worked it out. Magic. He showed her with his fingers on the edge of the desk. 62442. Correct, she said. She wrote it down. She always wrote things down. Date, time, name, method of arrival, small boy, train, dawn, alone, borrowed clothes, worked out the phone number. She underlined alone. Tell me about the cupboard, she said. He looked at the window. It was the first time in the conversation that he had looked away from her. It was my room, he said. At Privet Drive. I slept there. Under the stairs. Since when? He thought. As long as I can remember. I don't know exactly. Your best estimate? Always, he said. Basically always. She wrote this down. Is there anyone at Privet Drive, she asked, who has treated you well? A neighbour? A teacher? Anyone inside the house? He was quiet for longer than she expected. He was not a child who rushed to fill silences. She noticed this. He appeared to actually think about her question, to check against memory rather than give the obvious answer. Eventually he said, "No." She set down her quill. She had seen this moment in other offices, other circumstances. The moment a child named something simply, without appeal, without softening it into something the adult could more easily hold. A child who could do that had learned early that softening was not reliably rewarded. She stayed with it for the moment it deserved, which was not long. She thought briefly about Edgar. Her brother Edgar had been killed in late 1981, along with his wife and his children. She did not think about this at work. What she meant by that was, she had learned how not to think about it in the part of her mind that made decisions. The part that continued to know was elsewhere, present always, but not consulted. There were children who had grown up without their families because of what happened in 1981. Some of them were old enough now to walk into ministry offices with letterheads and borrowed clothes, and the stillness of a child who had never had the luxury of expecting anything to go right. She had known this for years. She picked up her quill. She opened the inquiry log and wrote, "Demel Welfare Inquiry, Harry James Potter, Bidsarf, 31st July 1980, registered wizard minor." Opened, and the date. She pressed the DML seal to the page. She closed the log. An open file required follow-up, documentation, and resolution. It did not close without all three. She sent a memo to Pratchett. He appeared in the doorway with the slightly uncertain look he wore when summoned at unusual hours. Barely past 7:30. "3 things," she said. "First, arrange ministry guest accommodation for Mr. Potter, a room on level 6, clean, adequate. Second, a formal summons for Vernon and Petunia Dursley of 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey, required to present for interview regarding the welfare of a wizarding minor in their care. This week. Delivered by Ministry Owl today. I want no ambiguity about notice. Third, a letter to Albus Dumbledore, Headmaster, Hogwarts. Inform him a formal DMLE welfare inquiry has been opened regarding Harry James Potter. His statement, as the person who arranged the guardianship placement, is requested at his earliest convenience. Official inquiry correspondence." The headmaster specifically, ma'am. The letter was sent from Hogwarts. It was signed by the deputy headmistress. The question of how this child came to be addressed to a cupboard is one I expect the headmaster has information about. He should know the subject is now under review. Pratchett went. She turned back to Harry. He had sat through all of this with the same quality of attention she had noticed from the first moment. Not passive, not anxious. Watching. Filing things away. A child who had learned to observe rather than to ask. "You cannot return to Privet Drive tonight," she said. "The ministry has accommodation. You will stay there." "Okay," he said. "I am opening an official inquiry into your care." "Do you understand what that means?" He shook his head, small and honest. "It means I am going to find out what has been happening to you. And then I am going to do something about it." She held his gaze because direct was kinder than soft. That is what this department does. It doesn't happen overnight. But it happens. Something shifted in his expression. She had seen this before too. The face of someone receiving news they had stopped expecting, holding it carefully in case it stopped being true. "Okay," he said, more quietly. She asked Pratchett to take him upstairs, then pulled ministry stationery toward her and uncapped her quill. She did not know yet about the blood enchantment, or the prophecy, or why Dumbledore had placed the child in that house specifically, with that woman's blood in the walls. She did not know about the godfather clause that should have transferred guardianship in November 1981, or the man in Azkaban whose conviction had no trial record. She would learn all of these things in the order they reached her desk, with the appropriate questions for each. What she knew now: an envelope addressed to a cupboard. A child who had walked across London alone at dawn because someone had written his name on something, and who had worked out a 6-digit access code from first principles because no one had ever thought to show him the door. She wrote the letter to Dumbledore. The facts as she had them, the address copied out in full, the formal request for his statement, and signed it with the seal that was a small round owl. She set it in the urgent tray with the other 2 memos, opened Harry's file, thin, so far, 1 sheet, and began to write what she would need to know before the Dursleys arrived. Outside the enchanted window, the Ministry's artificial light came on, golden and steady. She wrote. The room was on level 6 of the Ministry of Magic, and it had a window. Not a real window. The view was an enchanted image of somewhere in the English countryside, a field in early morning light, dew on the grass, a line of hills in the distance. Harry knew it was enchanted because he was underground. He looked at it anyway, sitting on the edge of a bed that was simply a bed, not a second bedroom converted from something else, not borrowed or grudging, just a room with a bed in it, and a wardrobe, and a rug, and a chair. He had not known what to do with any of it. He had slept. That was the other remarkable thing. He had slept through the night without once waking to the sound of the staircase above him, because there was no staircase above him. He was sitting in the chair by the enchanted window when the knock came. The officer who came in was young. He had the look of someone who had drawn the short straw in an assignment meeting and was trying very hard not to show it. He introduced himself, sat on the edge of the bed, and folded his hands. "Right," he said. "So, you're a wizard." Harry waited. "You were born with magic. It runs in families, mostly. Your mother had it. Your father had it. You have it." The officer had clearly prepared a more comprehensive explanation and was already abandoning it in the face of Harry's level attention. Unusual things happen around some people, and there's a reason for that. And the reason is magic, Harry said. "Yes, exactly." A pause. Is that all right? Information-wise? Harry considered. He had been waiting his whole life for an explanation of the unusual things. He had assumed, when they happened, that they were accidents. Things to be blamed for, things that would cause trouble, not things that were his. He had not been told they were his. "Yes," he said. "What's the school?" The officer relaxed slightly. "Hogwarts, School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, the school for magical children in Britain. You have a place there, starting September." "Why does my scar hurt sometimes?" Harry asked. The officer's expression went through several things quickly. We'll explain that. It's connected to something we need to go through properly. Someone senior will sit with you today and explain the full picture." Harry nodded. He filed it. The officer's second visit was shorter. He settled into the same position, hands folded on the edge of the bed, and took a breath that suggested he had rehearsed this part more carefully. "Your parents," he said. "James Potter. He was a wizard. He was respected. Both of them were. Your mother, Lily Potter, née Evans, a witch, what we call Muggle-born. She came from a non-magical family, but she was exceptionally talented. Charms, particularly. Potions." Harry was watching him closely. There was a war in the wizarding world. In the 70s and early 80s, your parents were part of it, on the right side. The officer stopped trying to cushion it. They were killed in 1981. You were 1 year old. The enchanted window showed the field, the dew, the hills. Were they brave? Harry asked. Yes. Very. Did they love me? The officer blinked. He shifted slightly, recalibrating from the prepared version of this conversation to something more direct. Yes, he said. They did. Very much. Harry looked at the window for a moment. Thank you, he said. He did not cry. He had had a decade's practice at not crying, and that practice did not fail him now. What he felt was not grief, not yet, not properly. Grief required knowing what you had lost, and he had only just received the inventory. But something quieter and more precise. The ache of learning that two people who had loved him had existed, and that the fact of their love had outlasted them, and that he had not known until now. He stayed with it for exactly as long as the officer was willing to be still, and then he filed it alongside everything else and waited to understand it properly. They had been in interview room 3 for 20 minutes before anyone came to speak to them, and Vernon had spent most of that time establishing, in a rising monologue, exactly what he believed his legal position to be. Petunia sat with her hands in her lap and said nothing. She had been to the Ministry of Magic once before, in 1981, when she had been brought here. Not to this room, a different one, to be told, briefly and without cruelty, that her sister was dead. She remembered the face of the woman who had told her. She did not remember her name. She remembered thinking, with absolute precision, I am the only one left of my family. The senior officer who came in set a file on the table and did not apologize for keeping them waiting. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley, I'll be asking you a series of questions about Harry Potter's living arrangements at your property. You're not obliged to answer without legal counsel, but you should know we have already taken Mr. Potter's own statement, and the physical evidence will corroborate it when our officers visit the property. She opened the file. Where does Harry sleep? The boy has a perfectly, Vernon began. The cupboard under the stairs, Petunia said. Vernon looked at her. That is what we will find, Petunia said, to the officer, not to Vernon. There is no point in saying otherwise. The officer wrote this down. Has that been the arrangement since he arrived at your home in November 1981? Yes. Has he been told he is a wizard, or given any information about the wizarding world? No. Vernon's monologue had stopped. He was watching his wife with the expression of a man who had arrived with a plan and found it changed without his input. Petunia answered each question with one answer, precisely, giving nothing that wasn't asked for. She had been managing information for 10 years. The information she managed was this. She had known, from the night the boy appeared on her doorstep in a bundle of blankets with a letter tucked beneath him, what he was and why he was there. The letter from Dumbledore had been plain enough. A protection tied to blood. Lily's blood, flowing in Petunia by virtue of having the same parents, and therefore capable of sustaining an enchantment that would keep the child safe while he remained in her house. She had understood what the letter was asking. She was not a stupid woman, and the letter had not been unclear. She had understood she was being asked to shelter a child because of what his mother's death had made possible. What she had not understood, or what she had chosen not to understand, which was not precisely the same thing, was that necessary and kind were not the same obligation. That being the vessel for a magical protection did not mean the boy inside the vessel could sleep in a cupboard and wear her son's cast-offs and be told nothing about who he was. The officer asked, had she received any communication in 1981 explaining why Harry was placed with her? Yes, Petunia said. A letter. From whom? Albus Dumbledore. She gave this freely, because it would come out regardless, and because she had decided in the lift, coming down, that the simplest version of events was the most defensible one. She had been told. She had taken the boy. She had done what she understood to be her part. She hadn't asked what else her part included. The file from Hogwarts arrived by owl at 11 in the morning. The trace registration for Harry James Potter, dated November 1981. His address listed as 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. Household classification, Muggle resident wizarding minor. Amelia read it. She read the address. She looked at the Hogwarts acceptance letter she had retrieved from Harry the previous morning, the one he had carried across London in his jacket pocket, and found the signature. Minerva McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress. A Deputy Headmistress signed acceptance letters. What was less routine was that the letter, signed by the same person, named the delivery address as the cupboard under the stairs, and that there was no note anywhere in the file, no flag, no welfare query, suggesting that anyone at Hogwarts had read that address and asked a follow-up question. She wrote to Hogwarts on official inquiry stationery. Please advise. When was the cupboard under the stairs, 4 Privet Drive, first registered in Hogwarts records as Harry James Potter's place of residence? Were any welfare concerns noted in the registry at any point? Please provide all relevant records as a matter of urgency. She sealed it and sent it. Then she opened both interview transcripts, Harry's and the Dursleys, and began to compare them. They were consistent on every point. That told her something she had half expected. When 2 independent accounts of an arrangement agree exactly, it means the arrangement was not a secret. It means everyone involved understood what the arrangement was. It had simply never been questioned. Until now. The letter from Dumbledore arrived by owl before 9:30. Fast. Amelia noted this. She had sent her inquiry the previous morning. He had replied before she had time to wonder whether he would delay. Either he had been anticipating contact, in which case he had known this outcome was possible and prepared his response, or he was not a man who delayed when something important required his answer. Both possibilities told her something. She sent the owl away and read the letter at her desk. It was long, careful, written with the particular quality of a document that had been drafted and revised, rather than composed in one sitting, every sentence carrying exactly what it intended to carry, and nothing else. It began without preamble. It did not include an apology. He set out the blood protection first. In October 1981, Lily Potter had died making a voluntary sacrifice. She had been offered the chance to stand aside and had refused. That refusal, made freely, in full knowledge of its cost, had created a protective enchantment tied to the person it was intended for. The enchantment was not passive. It was anchored by the law of magical sacrifice to the blood of the only remaining person who shared Lily's lineage, her sister, Petunia. As long as Harry lived in Petunia Dursley's home and called it home each year, no agent or remnant of Lord Voldemort could harm him within those walls or touch him in the wider world while the protection held. The enchantment would last until he came of age at 17. Amelia read this section twice. She understood blood magic. It was a documented field. The principle was established in the literature going back centuries. What she was reading was not speculation. What she was reading was the architecture of a precisely designed constraint. Harry Potter could not be extracted from the Dursley household without dismantling the protection he would need as long as Voldemort's threat remained unresolved. The house had to be his home. Petunia Dursley was a load-bearing element of the enchantment. There was no substitute, and Dumbledore had known this since 1981. She turned the page. The second thing he set out was the existence of a prophecy. He did not quote it in full. He summarized its structure. There existed a prophecy concerning Harry Potter and the architect of his parents' deaths. The prophecy was the reason Harry's survival had to be arranged quietly rather than celebrated. A child publicly known as the person Voldemort had failed to kill would have been a standing target for every remaining adherent who wished to complete what their master had not. His upbringing had needed to be ordinary. His location had needed to remain unknown. "I made a calculation," Dumbledore wrote, toward the end of the second page. "I weighed what I understood to be true about the magical protection against the difficulty of the placement, and I concluded, without hesitation at the time, that the protection was the greater necessity. I stand by the logic of that calculation. I do not stand in the way of this inquiry, and I will cooperate fully with any questions you wish to put to me directly." Amelia set the letter down. She sat with her hands flat on the desk and looked at it. Then she took up her case notes and wrote, "Dumbledore's account does not address why the conditions at Privet Drive were not monitored. The blood protection requires Harry to call the house home. It does not require that the house make such a claim impossible. Dumbledore states the enchantment responds to emotional reality. A child who is treated as a servant and confined to a cupboard is not a child who can readily call that place home. The conditions as established are therefore harmful on their own terms and potentially counterproductive to the protection Dumbledore intended to maintain. These two facts will require his direct response." She underlined the last sentence and set the notes aside for Dumbledore's in-person meeting. Then she drafted her reply, brief, official, acknowledging his response and requesting that he attend the ministry in person at his earliest convenience. She was sealing the envelope when the memo from Cornelius Fudge arrived through the internal post. She recognized his administrative style before she had read a word. Formal in precisely the places where formality could not be held against him. Warmly, carefully vague, wherever clarity would commit him to a position. The Minister for Magic wrote, in his capacity as someone who had heard about an inquiry tangentially through a clerk, that given the understandable sensitivities around the Potter name, and given the potential for public misunderstanding of what were, he was sure, a set of well-intentioned, if imperfectly executed arrangements, it might be worth considering whether a formal inquiry was the appropriate vehicle. A more informal resolution between the relevant parties might achieve the same outcome with considerably less. He used the word disruption. He remained, of course, entirely supportive of the department's important work and looked forward to the matter being concluded with characteristic efficiency. Amelia did not reply. She opened Harry's inquiry folder and placed the memo inside, behind the Dursleys' interview transcripts and Dumbledore's letter. It was now part of the official record. If anyone at any later date needed to establish who had attempted to influence an active inquiry, and at what stage, and in what terms, the memo would be there, time-stamped and unambiguous. She closed the folder and wrote her afternoon schedule. At 2:00, Harry Potter. He was already in the small meeting room on level 6 when she arrived, sitting in the chair closest to the window, the enchanted one, showing a grey afternoon somewhere in the countryside. He had the look of someone who had spent the morning thinking carefully about something he did not yet have enough information to think about properly. She sat down across from him without preamble. "I'm going to tell you about the person who killed your parents," she said. "I've decided you deserve to hear it directly, not in pieces." He looked at her steadily. He nodded. "His name is Voldemort." She watched his face. He did not flinch from the name, which told her something. "He was a dark wizard, the most dangerous in a century by most assessments. He rose to power over the course of the 1970s. He killed many people, including both of your parents, on the 31st of October 1981. He then turned his attention to you. And failed, Harry said. And failed. He attempted a killing curse. It rebounded. We don't know exactly why. He was destroyed, but not killed. What happened to him was not quite death. He lost his body. His power collapsed. His followers scattered. He was reduced to something barely present in the world. Is he dead? No one is certain. She let him hold that. He looked at the window for a moment, at the grey light and the flat countryside. Will he come back? She held his gaze. He was 10 years old, and he was asking the question levelly, without appeal, the way he seemed to do everything. That, she said, is what some people are afraid of. He looked at the table. A beat. My scar, he said. Is it connected? Yes. The curse left a mark. We believe the mark is the point where the curse met whatever force stopped it. She kept her voice factual, because it was facts he was asking for. We do not fully understand what the mark contains. That is an honest answer, not a careful one. Harry lifted his hand and touched his forehead, the scar he had always had and never been told about. His hand came back down to the table. He did not ask anything else. He sat with the information the way he seemed to sit with everything, without trying to resolve it prematurely, without filling the silence with words that would not help. He was waiting until he understood enough to ask the right question. She let him. She was in no hurry. Outside the enchanted window, the grey afternoon held steady, impersonal and unhurried, the same light that fell on Privet Drive and the Ministry both, on the living and the dead, and the questions that remained between them. He arrived at 10 in the morning, on the dot, which Amelia suspected was deliberate. The security wizard at the front desk was visibly uncertain about the correct protocol for screening Albus Dumbledore, whether the standard procedure applied, or whether some unwritten accommodation was expected, and Dumbledore resolved this for him by emptying his pockets voluntarily and waiting with patience while the instruments did their work. He accepted the visitor badge. He allowed himself to be directed. He did not use his name as leverage, which she noted, and which told her something about how he understood the meeting they were about to have. He was tall, the floor-length silver beard and hair, the half-moon spectacles perched on a crooked nose, the long robes. All of it was exactly as the photographs suggested, and the photographs had never quite captured the eyes. A very clear, very attentive blue that took in everything in the corridor without appearing to register any of it in particular. A man who saw more than he showed. She had him brought directly to the DMLE conference room, not her office. The conference room was for formal proceedings, interviews, official notifications, meetings at which something was being put on the record. It was neutral ground, precisely positioned, and she had decided on it when she scheduled the meeting and did not second-guess it now. She was already seated when he came in. She had the letter on the table, the Hogwarts acceptance letter, the one Harry had carried across London in his inside pocket, envelope face up, the address clearly readable. She had her case notes. She had a quill she did not intend to use in the first few minutes. She did not stand. "Headmaster," she said. "Madam Bones." He settled into the chair across from her, with an ease that suggested a man comfortable in difficult rooms. He placed his hands on the table. He looked at the envelope. Neither of them said anything. She had learned, over 31 years, to treat silence as an instrument, to hold it until the other person felt its shape and understood what it was asking. Dumbledore, she observed, understood this. He sat in the silence without visible discomfort, without attempting to fill it with something congenial or diplomatic. After a moment, he said quietly, "I wondered when this would happen." "Did you?" "I am a man who makes plans," he said. "And I am old enough to know that any plan held long enough must eventually be accounted for." She let that stand without response and let him begin. He set out the blood magic in the language of a man who had studied it in depth. The sacrifice, the anchor, the way an enchantment of that magnitude required a genuine home rather than a technical address. He explained what it meant that the protection was tied to Petunia Dursley specifically, not merely to the building, but to her blood, to the fact that she and Lily had shared parents, and that this bond of lineage was the foundation on which everything else rested. He explained the prophecy in the same measured terms, not quoting it, not dramatizing it, describing its structure and what it implied, that a child publicly celebrated as Voldemort's defeat would become a focus for every adherent who wished to prove the defeat was temporary. The ordinariness had been the point. The anonymity had been the protection. The placement with Petunia had been the only arrangement that satisfied the blood requirement, the secrecy requirement, and the requirement that Harry grow up unnoticed and in the safety of a Muggle household where no trace of magic would draw attention. He was calm throughout. He was not deflecting or minimizing. Every word he said was, as far as she could verify, true. You could have sent someone to check, Amelia said. The fewer people who knew his location, once a year, one person, a welfare visit. She did not raise her voice. There was no need. The DMLE has protocols for exactly this situation. A wizarding minor placed in a Muggle household, with no knowledge of his heritage, with no magical point of contact. You could have requested oversight. You chose not to. Dumbledore was quiet. You chose a child's decade, she said, based on a calculation you made in the worst week of the wizarding world, and then you did not revisit it. She placed her case notes on the table between them. 10 years passed, and no one checked. He looked at the case notes. He did not look away. No, he said. No one did. Not a defense, not a qualification. She noted the difference and moved on. I need to understand the protection precisely, she said. Does it require that Harry be kept in poor conditions? Or does it only require that he return to the house and call it home? A pause. Not a long one, but deliberate. The enchantment, Dumbledore said, responds to the emotional reality, not the physical one. Meaning. It requires that he mean it when he calls it home. He looked at her over the half-moon spectacles. The magic does not measure the quality of the bedroom. It measures the sincerity of the claim. Then the cupboard was never necessary. She said it in the same register as everything else. No emphasis, no particular weight, the way she would state any logical conclusion she had derived from the evidence before her. She was not making an accusation. She was drawing the line from his premises to its terminus, and she wanted him to hear it stated aloud, in this room, on this record. He was still for a long moment. No, he said. It was not. The conference room held that for a moment. She wrote it in her case notes. He watched her write. She thought this was part of why the case notes were on the table, not merely to record, but to make the act of recording visible. The information now existed on paper, in her handwriting, dated in an official file that would not close without resolution. That was what this room was for. She had written, that morning in her private notes, before the meeting, "He is not a villain." She had written it as a reminder to herself, because the cleanest cases she had handled were the ones with a clear villain, and this was not that. This was a man who had made a decision in an impossible week with the best information available to him, and had then not revisited it for 10 years. The calculation had worked, in the strictest sense. Harry was alive. The cost of the calculation had been Harry's first decade. Both of those things were true at the same time, and neither cancelled the other. She put the quill down. The blood protection requires that he return to the house each summer until he comes of age, she said. I understand that. I am not acting against it. But the conditions inside that house are going to change. The Dursleys will be compelled, legally by this department, under threat of criminal proceedings under wizarding law, to provide adequate care. A proper bedroom, regular meals, knowledge of his heritage which has been withheld without justification, and this department will conduct quarterly welfare checks to verify compliance. Dumbledore looked at her. You would have him return to people who have mistreated him. I would have him return to a house where those people have been legally obligated to treat him correctly, and where we will be watching to ensure they do. She met his gaze evenly. That is a materially different arrangement from the one you established in 1981. He was quiet for a longer time than he had been quiet at any other point in the meeting. The clock on the wall made the seconds audible. Yes, he said, finally. It is. She gathered her notes and straightened the edges against the table. He did not move immediately to leave. He sat with his hands folded, and she thought he looked, for the first time since he had entered the room, his considerable age. The boy, he said. Is he well? He is in ministry accommodation. He has a window. He has been told the truth about who he is and what happened to his parents. She was not cruel about the comparison, but she was not going to pretend Privet Drive and Level 6 were equivalent. He is adjusting. Dumbledore nodded. He rose, and she let him out, and then she returned to her desk. The file on Harry Potter had acquired a second volume. She labelled it, dated it, and placed it in the cabinet. The record existed. The confrontation was complete, and it had not resolved into accusation, which would have been too simple, or into forgiveness, which would have been dishonest. It had resolved into a set of facts, agreed upon, written down. She had found, over 31 years in this building, that facts were more durable than either. Interview Room 3 was smaller than the conference room she had used for Dumbledore, and that too was a deliberate choice. The conference room suggested equals across a table. Interview Room 3 suggested something more specific about the nature of the meeting. Vernon Dursley had been blustering since the Ministry Owl reached him, and he had not stopped. By the time Amelia entered with the file, he had established, to no one who particularly cared, that he had been given insufficient notice, that he had important professional obligations, that he had sought legal advice, and that he was a man who paid his taxes and kept his hedges trimmed and had done nothing wrong. He was large, and he was loud, and he had arrived believing that volume was a form of argument. Petunia sat with her handbag in her lap and had not spoken. She was controlled in the particular way of someone who had learned that control was more useful than volume, and she watched Amelia come in with the expression of a woman who had been waiting to find out what the next thing was. Amelia sat down, opened the file, and waited until Vernon finished. It took a moment. She nodded to Pratchett, who read from the findings document in the flat professional tone she had spent some time training into him. Harry James Potter, born 31st July 1980, has slept in the cupboard under the stairs at 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey, since approximately November 1981. He has not been told he is a wizard or provided with any information about the wizarding world or his parents. He has not been provided with age-appropriate sleeping accommodations at any point during his residence. He has been required to perform household tasks beyond what is age-appropriate for a child of his years. The room was quiet when Pratchett finished. Vernon opened his mouth. "Mr. Dursley," Amelia said, "I'll come to your opportunity to respond." He closed it. His face had gone a complicated red. She explained the magical reality in plain terms, because plain terms produced fewer disputes than delicate ones, and she had no interest in ambiguity. There was an enchantment on the property at 4 Privet Drive, It existed because of Harry Potter's mother and what she had done in October 1981. The full technical mechanics were documented and certified. She was not required to explain them entirely to non-magical persons, but the relevant fact was this. The enchantment required Harry to return to that house and to call it home each year until his 17th birthday on the 31st of July 1997. If the arrangement failed, if the house became genuinely uninhabitable, or the conditions made the requirement impossible to meet, the protection would lapse. The consequences of that she did not describe in detail. She let the phrase consequences do the work. "You are Harry Potter's legal guardians," she said. "You have been discharging that responsibility inadequately. This department is in a position to compel you to discharge it properly, or to prosecute you for continuing to fail. Those are the options." She let them sit with that for a moment. It was Petunia who broke the silence, not Vernon. "I knew," she said. She said it to the table, not to Amelia. "I was told. There was a letter." Amelia looked at her and waited. "From Dumbledore, when Harry arrived, in 1981. Petunia's voice was even and measured, the voice of a woman managing distance between what she knew and what she said. "There was a letter with him on the doorstep. It explained about the protection, about what Lily had done, and what it meant for keeping him in the house. I understood it." A pause. The handbag in her lap stayed absolutely still. "I did not think," she said, "that understanding it obliged me to be kind. I thought it obliged me to keep him alive and in the house. I thought those were the same thing." The room was very quiet. "They are not the same thing," Amelia said. Petunia did not disagree. She looked at the table. "You understood that Harry's presence in your home was connected to something important. You understood there was a specific reason he was placed with you and not someone else. For 10 years you provided the minimum possible version of what a guardian is, and you called it sufficient." Amelia kept her voice level. "You were wrong about the extent of the obligation. We are here to correct that understanding, and to formalize the correction in terms you will both be held to." Vernon had gone through several colors during this exchange. He had settled on something between red and grey that suggested his anger and his fear were fighting for the same face, and neither was winning cleanly. Pratchett placed the document on the table. He read the terms aloud, for the record. Harry James Potter would return to Fort Privet Drive each summer until his 17th birthday. The Dursleys would provide a proper bedroom, with a door that locked from the inside, with adequate furniture, with a window, not a cupboard, not a converted storage space, regular meals at family meal times, not a separate arrangement. Harry would not be prevented from learning about the wizarding world or receiving wizarding correspondence. He would not be required to perform household labor beyond what was reasonable and age-appropriate. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement would conduct a welfare check at 4 Privet Drive on 4 occasions per year, unannounced. "Breach of any of these terms," Amelia said, "will result in formal criminal proceedings under wizarding law." Vernon said, "Criminal? What does criminal—" "Prison," Amelia said. "Ours, not yours. I advise you not to find out what the difference is." He stared at the document. His hands went flat on the table, the way a man's hands go flat when the options in front of him have narrowed to one. Petunia picked up the quill. She signed. She did not look at Vernon before she did it. She did not look at him after. She set the quill down, straightened in her chair, and remained facing forward with the bearing of a woman who had made a decision she had possibly been working toward for a long time. There was something in it. Not relief, not defiance, not the expression of someone who had won something. more like the particular quality of setting down a weight differently after carrying it wrong for 10 years. She had carried the knowledge of what the arrangement was, and what she had chosen not to understand about it, and perhaps she had found it heavier than she'd accounted for at the start. Vernon signed. He held the quill in a way that suggested he resented the quill specifically. He set it down hard. Amelia signed as witness, Pratchett as second. "Copies to both parties," Pratchett said, "with the original filed at DMLE. Your first welfare check will be in November." She watched them on the way out, the set of Vernon's shoulders still taut with outrage that had nowhere to go, the set of Petunia's, which had something different in them that she couldn't entirely name. She filed both observations. She had a feeling Petunia Dursley was going to be more interesting over the next 6 years than Vernon was. Harry was at the table in the Level 6 meeting room, at the window showing its grey afternoon countryside, when she came to find him. She sat down and told him the outcome in the order that mattered: a proper bedroom, a real one with a door and a window. He would return to Privet Drive in summers, but the arrangement would be different. Specific terms had been agreed and signed, and this department was responsible for making sure those terms held. He listened without interrupting, the way he listened to everything. "What if they don't?" he asked. "Then they face criminal proceedings," she said, "and I will be the one pressing the charges." Harry looked at her. It was the same look he had given her that first morning, not searching, not performing anything, just processing, calibrating the information against what he knew. "Okay," he said. She had seen this before, not often, but enough to recognize it. The moment a child was told, for the first time, that an adult would be on their side, would put it in writing and mean it, and did not know what to do with that information because there was no existing frame to put it in. He was 10 years old. He had grown up understanding that he was not someone things were done for. He would have to learn a different understanding now, and that would take time, and she could not accelerate it. She stood to go. She let him be with it. The file on Harry Potter went back into the cabinet with a third volume now added, the agreement signed and witnessed and dated. The custodial case was not closed. It would remain open until Harry turned 17, but the critical work was done. She went back to her desk. There was another file waiting for her there, one she had been putting off reading for 2 days because she had been occupied with this one. She opened it. The Potter placement file was indexed under Covert Placements, 1981, and had sat there undisturbed in the sub-basement archive for almost 10 years. The clerk who retrieved it was thorough and methodical, and had pulled hundreds of placement files without incident. She opened it on her desk, located the section on guardianship, and began to read. The file recorded the placement: Harry James Potter, born 31st of July 1980, placed with Petunia and Vernon Dursley of 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey, in November 1981, under the oversight of Albus Dumbledore, headmaster, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. The placement was classified as informal guardianship, made without a formal order from the Wizengamot. The file named the legal guardian designate Sirius Orion Black, and then it recorded his arrest and his imprisonment. She looked for the trial record, standard procedure. If the guardian designate had been imprisoned, there would be a Wizengamot proceeding referenced here, a hearing number, a verdict, a sentencing notation. She read the relevant page. She read it again to make sure she had not missed something. She had not missed something. She flagged the page with a query slip and carried the file upstairs. Amelia read the black file in her office with the door closed. It was not thick. That was part of what was wrong with it. For a man convicted of 12 murders and the wartime betrayal of 2 wizarding families, The documentation was remarkably thin. There was an arrest report. There was a statement, a confession of sorts, delivered at the arrest scene rather than in an interview room, witnessed by aurors who had not been accompanied by any legal representative for the accused. There was a transfer record to Azkaban, dated November 1981. There was no Wizengamot proceeding, no hearing date, no transcript of testimony, no verdict recorded by any authorized body. There was a confession witnessed by aurors, transcribed by aurors, filed by aurors, and then a man in Azkaban, and 10 years between those two facts and this desk. She set the file down. She was aware, in the moment of doing it, that she was being careful, placing it on the desk with a deliberateness that had nothing to do with the paper. Something that was already broken. She did not want to handle it carelessly and break it further. She sat for a moment and looked at it. She had not been head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement in 1981. She had taken the role later, in the years after Voldemort's fall, when the department was being rebuilt and the outstanding cases from the war were being— the word used at the time had been resolved. She knew what had been done in that period to achieve that resolution, the convictions, the speed of them, the pragmatic argument that the world had needed to be put back in order, and that due process could sometimes be slower than the circumstances permitted. She had understood that argument when it was made to her. She understood its logic now, and it had still produced this. A man in Azkaban with no trial. Over 9 years, the DMLE was her department. What it had done in 1981 was hers now to defend or to correct, and those were the only choices available to a head of department who took the role seriously. She wrote on the file cover, in her own hand, "Review required. Due process inquiry." She placed it on her desk beside Harry Potter's case folder. 2 files, side by side. She picked up her quill and wrote to Dumbledore. She informed him that in the course of reviewing records connected to the Potter placement, she had noted the file on Sirius Black, named therein as Harry Potter's legal guardian designate, and had noted the absence of any Wizengamot trial record. She intended to open a formal due process inquiry. She asked whether he had any knowledge of why no trial had been held, and what he had known or believed about the circumstances of Black's arrest and imprisonment in November 1981. She sent it by express owl. His reply arrived the following morning. She had expected something in the register of his previous letters, long, methodical, calibrated, each sentence carrying exactly what it intended to carry. His correspondence, so far, had been the correspondence of a man who understood what being examined required and had prepared accordingly. This letter was 3 paragraphs. He had been present in November 1981. He had been aware of Black's arrest. He had not intervened to ensure a trial was held because he had at the time believed the evidence against Black to be conclusive. Black had been named as the Potter's secret keeper, had been seen at the scene, had said things in front of aura witnesses that had been taken as a confession. He wrote, "I have wondered, in the years since, whether I was right to accept what I was told without requiring the process. I do not have a satisfying answer to that question." The 3rd paragraph said, "I will cooperate fully with your inquiry." It was the most honest letter he had sent her, and it was the shortest. She read it twice and put it in the black file. She opened a new inquiry log and wrote the case number. The due process inquiry was now formally open. Somewhere in Devon, in a household that was untidy in the particular warm way of a household with many children and not enough space, and no particular interest in managing either, a small grey rat sat on a windowsill in the afternoon sun. He had been a rat for almost 10 years. He was very good at it. He was good at being small and warm and unnoticed, at being stroked occasionally and fed without being examined. at existing in the periphery of a family that had no reason to look at him closely or wonder about him at all. The Weasley children called him Scabbers. They had owned him for years, one after another, or he had passed between them. The distinction was one he did not make much of. He was a family rat. He was ordinary. He did not know that in London, in the Ministry of Magic, a clerk had gone looking for a trial record and not found one. He did not know that a file had been placed on a desk alongside another file, or that a letter had been written to Albus Dumbledore asking a question that had not been asked in the 10 years since the answer might have mattered. He did not know that a formal inquiry had been opened this morning. He was the piece of evidence that no investigation knew to look for, which was precisely the position he had spent a decade arranging for himself. This thread was not going to close soon. It was not going to close within the scope of this story. It would take years, and different circumstances, and a different set of people looking at a different set of facts. For now, the rat sat in the sun in Devon, warm and undisturbed, and the inquiry proceeded without him, missing the one thing that would make it answerable. Harry did not know about any of this yet. He was in the room on level 6 with the enchanted window, reading a copy of the Daily Prophet that had been left for him, full of things he didn't fully understand, but was reading with the attention of someone who had just learned the world was significantly larger than he had thought, and who intended to understand its shape as quickly as possible. He had written a letter to Hagrid, because Hagrid had seemed like someone he could write to. He had folded it and given it to the DMLE officer on the morning shift to send. He was, as far as Amelia could determine from the brief update she had received, doing the thing he seemed to do with everything: adapting, filing, waiting until he understood enough to ask the right question. She left him to it. In her office, at the end of a day that had begun with a routine file pull and become something considerably less routine, she sat at her desk. On her left, Harry Potter's custody file. On her right, Sirius Black's. Both labelled, both dated, both open. Both failures of the institution she now headed. She did not find it useful to distinguish between what had been done before her tenure and what had been done during it. The department's record was the department's record, and she was the department now, and the accounting was hers. She opened a new page in her working notes and began mapping what the Black inquiry would require: the original Aura reports, the witness statements, the arrest documentation, the names of everyone who had processed this case in 1981, and the reasons, as far as they could be established, why no one had raised the question before tonight. The enchanted lights dimmed slowly toward their ministry version of evening. She wrote until they had dimmed entirely, then gathered both files and locked them in the cabinet, equidistant from each other, which was not something she normally thought about, but did tonight. She would be back in the morning. The officer who checked on Harry each morning mentioned it at 7:30, almost as an afterthought. 31st today, then. Happy birthday. Harry had not known. He had lost track of the days slightly, in the way that was easy to do when each one had the same enchanted window and the same schedule and no external markers to distinguish it from the last. He looked at the officer and said, "Thank you," and the officer went away, and Harry sat for a while with the knowledge that he was 11 now, and that no one at Privet Drive had ever said those 2 words to him in that order. He had not expected them to. He had not, if he was honest, expected them here either. He ate breakfast. He read. He was thinking about writing another letter to Hagrid. The first one had come back with a large, blotched note that said very little, except that the DMLE officer had been very kind and there was good news coming soon, which was warm if not informative. When the desk sent word upstairs, there was someone in the atrium asking for him. He heard Hagrid before he saw him. A voice like rocks rolling downhill carrying up the DMLE corridor even from the lift lobby. Harry came around the corner and stopped. No one had given him a visual. Hagrid was enormous, and he had known this. The briefing had said half giant, but the word enormous was doing only part of the work. He filled the ministry atrium the way weather filled a room. Wild black beard and hair that looked as though they had never reached an understanding with a comb, hands the size of dustbin lids, a moleskin overcoat with pockets that seemed to contain their own internal logic. Under one arm he carried an umbrella of startling pink. In the other, a cake box, slightly squashed. When he saw Harry, he crossed the atrium in roughly 3 steps and crouched, which brought him down to approximately the height of a very large wardrobe. "Harry, you're here. Course you are. Sorry. The ministry and all." Dumbledore explained. "Here." He held out the cake. It was lopsided, pink-iced, with lumpy letters across the top that read, "Happy Birthday, Harry." Harry looked at it. He looked at Hagrid. "Thank you," he said. He had said those 2 words twice in the last week, to the officer who had told him his parents were brave, and now to this enormous man who had carried a birthday cake across London, and both times it had been the only thing true enough to say. They found a room on level 6, not the one with the enchanted window, and sat across from each other with the cake between them and 2 cups of tea Hagrid had produced from one of the unfathomable pockets. Harry had cut the cake with a butter knife from the level 6 kitchen, because there wasn't anything else, and it turned out to be very good. "You knew them," Harry said. It was not quite a question. Hagrid did the thing Harry was beginning to recognize, the small recalibration that happened when people realized Harry already knew the basic facts, the war, the deaths, the survival, and had to adjust toward something more specific. "Yeah," Hagrid said. He cleared his throat. "Yeah, I did. Both of them." Harry waited. Hagrid told him things the DMLE officer had not. That James had played Quidditch, chaser, a good one, a really good one. Everyone who'd seen him said so. And that he'd had the same untidy black hair Harry saw every morning in the ministry bathroom mirror, and that he'd been the kind of person who made a room louder just by being in it. That Lily had been brilliant at charms, properly brilliant, the kind you recognized on sight, and that she had Harry's eyes exactly, or rather Harry had hers, the same green, unusual enough that people remarked on it, that she'd been steady and quiet in the way of someone deciding whether to trust you, and you knew when she'd decided. These were not the facts of war. They were the facts of people who his parents had been in a room, what had stuck in the memory of someone who had loved them. Harry found that he was crying, not at the deaths. He had known about those for a week, and had held the knowledge in a careful sort of way, numb and respectful. This was different. This was his father playing Quidditch with messy hair, his mother with his eyes, the sheer specific realness of them, the weight of their personhood beyond what the DMLE officer had been able to give him, because the officer had not known them. Hagrid cried as well, voluminously, and without any embarrassment about it, which Harry found helped. They went to Diagon Alley in the early afternoon. Hagrid knew the way without thinking, the difference between belonging to a world and being new to it. The leaky cauldron was dim and warm and slightly noisy. Everyone seemed to know Hagrid, and several people looked at Harry in the particular way he had started to recognize, the way that attached to his name, a reverence he still didn't know what to do with, so he mostly looked at the floor while they moved through. Hagrid tapped the brick wall in the back courtyard, 3 up, 2 across, and the bricks shifted and folded, and the alley opened up. Harry had been told he belonged here. Walking into it felt like evidence. The robes and the parchment and the scales and the cauldron were straightforward enough, and Hagrid handled most of it with the confidence of someone who had done this before. which he had. Harry followed and tried to look at everything at once, and failed pleasantly. Vault 687 was deep in the Gringotts vaults, reached by a cart that moved at a speed suggesting Gringotts had opinions about caution and found them unpersuasive. The vault door opened on gold. Harry stood in front of it, longer than was necessary. He had never had money. The £8.43 he had saved over years of errand change, spent on the train to London a week ago, represented the total of what had ever been his. The vault was James's, and now was his, and the weight of that was not about the gold. He took what he needed for his school things. He let Hagrid close the door. The wand shop was narrow and quiet, with a dustiness that felt purposeful rather than neglected, and a smell of something old and faintly electrical. The man who emerged from the back of it moved without making sound, which was slightly uncanny, and had pale, silvery eyes that appeared to take Harry's measure before he'd said a word. "Harry Potter," Ollivander said, less a greeting than a notation. He tried 7 wands before the 8th, holly, 11 inches, phoenix feather core, supple. When Harry closed his hand around it, something moved through the air of the shop. Warm sparks, a sensation like the moment before a door opens. And Ollivander went still. "Curious," he said. He was looking at the wand, not at Harry. The phoenix that provided this feather gave only one other. "You, 13.5 inches. He paused. "It is not always comfortable, Mr. Potter, to know what you share and with whom." Harry understood what he meant without needing it explained. He held the wand and felt something settle in his chest he could not name precisely, not power, not ownership. More like recognition, a thing finding its right position after being wrong for a long time. At Aesop's Owl Emporium, Hagrid stopped in front of a cage containing a snowy white owl and refused to be redirected. "You need an owl," he said, "for letters. Standard, really." The owl looked at Harry with amber eyes of considerable intelligence and at least some impatience. Harry looked back. The owl blinked once, which felt like an assessment. "That one?" Harry said. Hagrid bought her immediately and spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of pleased satisfaction about it that Harry found, to his own surprise, quite warm. On the way out of the alley, with the sun going low over the crooked rooftops and the alley getting its evening crowd, Harry carried the cage, and Hagrid carried everything else, and Harry thought about names. He had found Hedwig in a library book during his week at the Ministry, a history of magic, left on a shelf in the Level 6 common room, and the name had stayed with him, and he didn't know why exactly, but it felt right. He had school robes, books, a cauldron, a wand in his inside pocket that he kept checking to make sure was there. An owl named Hedwig who was studying him with the focused attention of someone deciding about a long-term commitment. He was the boy from the cupboard. He would always be that. It had marked him, the way the scar had marked him, the way 10 years leave their specific shape. But he was beginning to understand something more than only that. He had a vault with his father's gold and his name on the door. He had a wand that had chosen him and apparently had history. He had a birthday that 2 people had now acknowledged in the same morning. He walked out of Diagon Alley, carrying Hedwig, into the evening, into September. Platform 934 was the kind of thing that sounded impossible until it wasn't. Hagrid had explained, the barrier between platforms 9 and 10, the way through, what to expect on the other side. Harry arrived at King's Cross at 10:30 with his trolley, trunk, Hedwig in her cage, new robes folded on top, and found the barrier by watching. There was a large family at the far end of the station, all red hair and overlapping noise, making for the apparently solid wall between 9 and 10, with the confidence of people who had done this before. Harry fell in behind them and went through. The barrier had the quality of cold water, and then didn't. A half-second of pressure, and then the platform was there, and the noise, and the train. The Hogwarts Express was scarlet and enormous and breathing steam. He stood at the far end of the platform for a moment and let it settle. He already knew what he was. He already knew why he was here. There was no cannon fire revelation, the way it might have been for another version of him. Only the arrival at a place he had been told he belonged, and the process of learning what that meant in practice. The compartment he found had a boy about his age in it, red hair and freckles, and a smear of something on his nose he hadn't noticed. Harry asked if he could sit down. The boy said yes. Ron Weasley, one of the red-haired family from the platform. 5 brothers, 1 sister, and a rat called Scabbers, who appeared to be asleep in Ron's coat pocket and to have been asleep there for several years. He was the 6th child, and he told Harry this with the tone of someone who had long since come to terms with what it meant to be the 6th child, which was that everything had already been done before you got to it. He didn't recognize Harry's name when Harry gave it. "Potter," Ron said, and then his eyes went to Harry's forehead and then back to his face, with the expression of someone processing several things rapidly. "Sorry, I thought... You don't look like... The photographs," Harry said. "Yeah, sorry. Don't be." He meant it. He had met the recognition several times in the last month, and Ron's version was one of the better ones. Brief, honest, then set aside in favor of ordinary conversation. "First year?" Ron said. "Yeah," Harry said, and they got on with it. About an hour from London, the door opened, and a girl with very bushy brown hair looked in. "Have you seen a toad? A boy called Neville's lost one." They hadn't. She was turning to go when she noticed the wand on the seat beside Harry, where he'd set it while looking at it, still not entirely used to owning one. "Oh, are you doing magic? Let's see." She sat down and produced her own wand with the ease of someone who had been preparing for this. "I've been practicing since July. I've read all the course books." A pause. "I'm Hermione Granger." She had read all of them. Harry had read most of them in about a month, starting from nothing, which meant he had a working knowledge with no framework to hang it on. She had the framework. He thought there was probably something useful in that difference, if both of them were willing to be patient with each other. Ron looked slightly uncertain. Harry found her brisk thoroughness straightforwardly likable. Ron was, it turned out, an excellent guide to the things that weren't in the textbooks. Not the facts. Harry had the facts, roughly, from the DMLE sessions and from reading. But the texture. What Quidditch was actually like versus what the rule books said. What each of the houses meant in practice, not just what the books claimed they meant. The social geography. Which things everyone who'd grown up here understood without thinking, and which things you could get wrong if you hadn't. Harry asked a great many questions. He asked them with the specific curiosity of someone who knew the broad strokes and wanted the detail, not what things were, but what they were like. What it felt like to live in a world where magic was the water, rather than the discovery. Ron answered well. He had never had to think about these things as concepts, because they were simply his life, and that made him useful in exactly the way a textbook wasn't. Hermione occasionally added a fact from one of the books. Ron occasionally looked pained about this. Hagrid was there at Hogsmeade Station, calling for first years, and the boats were at the edge of the dark water. Harry found one and got in, and the castle appeared from around the cliff as they crossed, and he understood for the first time why someone might think it a sufficient answer to most things. It was enormous, and lit from within. The towers were pale against the sky. The black lake was very cold and very still, and the water reflected the castle lights in long, wavering lines, and Harry sat in the boat with the sound of oars and the smell of water, and looked up. He thought, "This is where my parents went, both of them, before the war, before Godric's Hollow, before everything that happened after. They had crossed this water in boats like this one, looking up at the same lights. He held that quietly for the rest of the crossing. Neville sat on his other side and held the edge of the boat with both hands against the cold and didn't speak, which Harry found companionable rather than awkward. The great hall had a ceiling that was doing something extraordinary with the night sky, and 100 candles floating over 4 long tables, and the noise of several hundred students who all knew each other. McGonagall, whom Harry recognized from her signature on the letter and from the Hogwarts file, produced the sorting hat from a stool at the front. It gave a speech and then set to work. Gryffindor, Granger, Hermione, Longbottom, Neville. Potter, Harry. The hall went quiet and then louder, and Harry walked to the table and sat down. Weasley, Ron, a few names later. Ron dropped into the seat on Harry's other side, with the expression of someone considerably relieved. Food appeared on the table. More food than Harry had been given for any single meal in 10 years, presented as though abundance was simply the default. And he registered this without making much of it, in the way that large changes sometimes required a moment before they became real. Neville Longbottom was round-faced and sitting in the careful way of someone who had learned to take up less space than he occupied. Harry already knew about his parents, not in detail, but the shape of it. Frank and Alice Longbottom. What had happened to them in the November after Voldemort fell, where they were now. He did not say any of this. He said, "Hi, I'm Harry." Neville said hi and looked relieved that was all it was, and Harry thought he understood why. The staff table ran along the far end of the hall, and Harry found Dumbledore first. The silver hair caught every candle, and experienced the particular sensation of recognizing someone whose decisions you knew before you had ever met them. He knew the logic that had put him in a cupboard. He knew that the logic had worked, in its coldest terms, and he knew what the logic had cost, and he knew that Dumbledore had acknowledged the cost was not necessary in a conference room in the Ministry of Magic, in front of a witness and a file. Harry held all of that at once, without resolving it into something simpler. He thought he understood now why adults found Dumbledore difficult. He made things complicated in a way that resisted reduction. Snape was further along the table. Sallow skin, lank black hair, dark eyes, scanning the first-year students with neutral watchfulness. The research had said, in the careful language of documented fact, that he had loved Lily Potter, and had protected Harry covertly since her death because of it. Snape's gaze moved along the row of new Gryffindors. It reached Harry. It stopped. Harry thought about his mother's green eyes, which were the same as his own. He thought about the word covertly, and what it implied about the 10 years behind them both, and about what it might imply about the year ahead. He thought that this was a great deal to hold about someone he had not yet spoken a word to. He filed it. There would be time. The adjustment was not to magic. He had expected magic. He had read about it, been told about it, felt the wand acknowledge him in Ollivanders. The spells came with the specific difficulty of any new skill, and learning them felt like anything else he'd had to learn. Patient, attentive, incremental. What he had not expected was the rest of it. Having a room, having a bed that was his, with curtains he could close, having food at every mealtime without having done anything to earn it, having mail come addressed to him From Hagrid, in enormous, blotchy writing, asking whether he'd made friends. From no one else, because there was no one else, which had always been true, and was only just now strange. He wrote to Hagrid. He told him about Ron and Hermione. Hagrid's reply was delighted. He also wrote to Amelia Bones. He was not entirely sure why. He just did. A brief note, nothing official, telling her he had arrived safely. She replied with 3 sentences. The November welfare check was confirmed. The Sirius Black inquiry was proceeding. He should eat properly. He read it twice and put it in his trunk. He had correspondence. He had someone who wrote to him with updates, as though what happened to him next was something tracked. He had not known, before July, that this was the kind of thing that could exist. The classes, he was finding, suited him. Not all equally. He had a month to catch up on what some of his classmates had grown up inside, and the gaps showed. But the spells required a specific quality of attention, not just repetition, but focused intention. And the focused part he seemed to have in surplus. It was, he thought, probably the kind of skill you developed when there was not much else to do in a cupboard. The first defense against the dark arts class was in the 3rd week of September. The teacher was a man called Quirrell. He wore a large purple turban and smelled of garlic and was twitchy in the particular way of someone who was frightened and trying not to show it. Harry sat in the 3rd row, and 20 minutes into the lesson, his scar began to hurt. Not badly. A low ache, like a bruise being reminded of. He had been told the scar was connected to the curse. He pressed his fingers briefly to his forehead and looked at Quirrell, who had his back to the class, the turban aimed at the board. He noted it. This man makes my scar hurt. He did not know what that meant. He filed it. He told Hermione afterward. She had the expression she wore when something didn't fit neatly into what she'd read. "I'll look into it," she said, and went to the library. The troll happened on Halloween. Quirrell came through the feast hall doors, white-faced, and announced there was a troll in the dungeons, and the hall stopped. Hermione was already gone. She'd slipped out a few seats down, and Harry and Ron went after her. They found the troll in the girls' bathroom on the 2nd floor. They also found Hermione, backed against the sinks, while the troll did structural damage with its club. Ron levitated the club. Hermione had been correcting his pronunciation of Wingardium Leviosa for 3 weeks. 2 syllables in, emphasis on the gar, flick on the levi. And it had been the kind of thing that could drive you apart or bond you permanently, depending on how the evening went. The club went up. The troll looked confused. Harry went for its kneecaps. They were given 20 points apiece and never left each other's company after that. The particular thing about being in danger together, Harry was discovering, was that it skipped steps. You learned quickly what someone was made of under those conditions, whether they ran toward the bathroom or away from it, whether they kept their head when the club came down, and the knowing, once arrived at, was permanent. Hermione's research produced a connection that Harry thought should have been noticed by a teacher. The Daily Prophet archives showed someone had broken into Gringotts Vault 713 on 31st July 1991. The same day, Harry had visited Diagon Alley. The same day, Hagrid had taken him to Vault 687. Vault 713 was listed in the Hogwarts historical records as a school-secured vault, which meant whatever had been in it had been moved to Hogwarts, which meant, she thought, the 3rd-floor corridor the headmaster had specifically told them not to enter. She laid this out in the library on a Tuesday evening, with the satisfaction of someone who had done work she expected to be appreciated. "Someone tried to steal it," Ron said. "The same day it was moved. That can't be coincidence." It couldn't. Harry visited Hagrid's hut on a Saturday in November. Fang pressed his boarhound head into Harry's knee. The fire made the hut warm against the cold. Harry mentioned, carefully, that he'd noticed something felt wrong about one of the teachers. He mentioned his scar. He mentioned which teacher. Hagrid went still. "What's in that corridor is well protected," he said. "Right well, 7 layers." He stopped. 7 layers of what? I shouldn't have said that. Hagrid. The creature at the top, Hagrid said, going red, needs music. That's all I'm saying. That's all. He looked profoundly unhappy with himself, and asked how Ron was, and how Hermione was getting on. Harry noted the slip, and went back to the castle. Snape's potions class was not what Harry had been bracing for. He had been bracing, based on nothing but instinct, and the complicated awareness of knowing something about this man that Snape did not know he knew, for some variety of confrontation. What happened was that Snape opened the class with rapid-fire questions, the kind designed to establish who had done the reading, and Harry, who had had 1 month of wizarding education as of September, answered what he could, and said nothing when he couldn't. Snape reached him. He paused. Harry looked back. He didn't look away. The pause lasted 3 seconds. Something shifted in Snape's expression. Not warmth, not recognition as such, but a slight adjustment from whatever he had been expecting. He moved on. Harry thought about his mother's green eyes, which were the same as his own. He thought that Snape had probably looked at that colour more often, and with more weight than he would ever fully know, and he held that the way he held most difficult things, carefully, without forcing it into a shape. The formal owl arrived in November during breakfast, landed in front of Harry with the unhurried confidence of an owl that knew exactly where it was going. He took it upstairs to the dormitory that night and read it by wand light. The Dursley Agreement was in force. The first quarterly welfare check had been completed, the second bedroom was prepared, and meeting the required standard. The Sirius Black due process inquiry had been formally opened and was proceeding. Progress only. No resolution to report, but the file was open and the work was underway. He folded the letter and put it in the bottom of his trunk. He lay on his bed and looked at the canopy. He had a formal owl from the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Someone in the ministry was tracking the outcomes of his situation, updating him on their progress, writing to him with news. He had correspondence. He had not known before July that this was a category of thing that could belong to him. The 3 of them argued over several weeks about who it was. Ron and Hermione both thought Snape. The absence of scar pain near him had ironically made him seem less suspect to Harry and more suspect to them, and they had arguments Harry couldn't easily refute. Harry thought Quirrell. The scar was specific. It only hurt near Quirrell, but he could hear how this sounded to someone who hadn't felt it. He thought about the summer, about learning in a ministry meeting room, that when there was time and someone to tell, you told them. He had told Amelia Bones about his cupboard. She had opened an inquiry. He thought about the letter in his trunk, and about what the word proceed meant when applied to things like due process and institutional accountability. He wrote the letter to her late in the dormitory, with Hedwig watching from her perch. I think someone at this school is trying to steal something dangerous. I think it is a teacher. I cannot explain everything in a letter. Please come if you can. Brief. Factual. He did not name Quirrell. He wanted her to come with an open mind. But he said a teacher, which was the important part. He tied it to Hedwig's leg. She regarded him for a moment with amber eyes, then went. It was the 3rd week of May, and Harry saw Quirrell moving toward the 3rd-floor corridor just after midnight. He had not been following him. He had been walking back from the library. Hermione had left a book she needed for her Transfiguration essay, and Harry had volunteered because he couldn't sleep. And there was Quirrell, purple turban, moving down the east corridor, with the particular purposefulness of someone who knows exactly where he is going and does not want to be seen. He had been walking like this for 8 months. Tonight the walk was different. Harry went back to Gryffindor Tower and woke Hermione and Ron. "He's going tonight," Harry said. Ron sat up. Hermione was already awake, reaching for her shoes. Before they left, Harry sat down at the common room desk and lit his wand. He wrote fast. "Quirrell is going for the stone tonight. We are going in after him. I know you cannot be here in time. I am telling you anyway. H. Potter." He tied it to Hedwig's leg. She regarded him for a moment with amber eyes, the patient expression of someone who has been awoken at midnight before and does not hold it against you. Then she went. The 3 of them went after her, down the dark corridor toward the east wing. The door to the 3rd floor corridor stood open. Beyond it, the trap door, and above the trap door, the sound of Fluffy, all 3 heads of him, asleep. Quirrell had left a harp playing. It was enchanted, small, the size of a lapdog, sitting on the stone floor beside the trap door and producing a thin, threadbare melody that was doing exactly enough. 3 enormous heads, 3 pairs of closed eyes, 3 chests rising and falling with the particular slowness of very deep sleep. "Quickly," Hermione said, "before it stops." They lowered themselves through the trap door. Below was dark and plant-smelling, moist, almost fungal. Something wrapped around Harry's ankle before he could register it, then his wrist, and he went still. Instinct, or 10 years of learning to go small when the thing that had you was larger. And Hermione's wand said, "Incendio." And the tendrils released. The devil's snare recoiled from light and fire. She held both steady until they were through. The chamber after the plants held hundreds of winged keys drifting in slow circuits near the ceiling, and broomsticks on the stone floor, and a door at the far end with an old-fashioned keyhole. The correct key had a damaged wing. Harry spotted it inside 30 seconds, which was perhaps 30 seconds faster than anyone else in this chamber could have managed. It was listing in its flight, compensating for the bent feather with a particular canted rotation he recognized from watching his own wrist on a bad seeking throw in November. He took the broom. He caught the key in 2 passes. He unlocked the door. The chess chamber was cold, and the pieces were the size of horses. Ron looked at the board and said, "I'll play." He directed Harry and Hermione into pieces and took the White Knight for himself. He played fast and deliberately, and at the point where he saw the only path through, he said, "Harry, when I do this, you'll have a clear run. Go straight through. Don't look back. Ron, go." He moved. The White Queen came for him. He did not look away. Harry and Hermione ran through the cleared path without looking back, because he had told them not to. The final room before the last held a line of 7 bottles on a stone sill, and a low purple flame across the doorway ahead, and a riddle in verse on a square of paper. Hermione read it once, read it again, and then picked up 2 of the bottles. "This one forward," she said, holding one out to Harry. "This one back. The others are poison or nettle wine." She looked at him. "I'm going back for help." Harry took the bottle she offered. It was cold and small, barely enough for 1 swallow. "If you don't," he started. "I'll find someone," she said. The expression on her face was the same one she used when she was entirely certain she was right about something. "Go." He drank it. He stepped through the flames. The final chamber was lit by no source Harry could identify, and the mirror stood at its far end. He had read about it. He had not expected to feel it, the pull of it, something in the room shifting when he stepped inside. The mirror was tall and gilt-framed, and the inscription along its top read, in reversed script, "Erised stra eru oit ube cafru oit on vosi." He looked into it, James was there, messy black hair, Harry's hair exactly, the hair he saw every morning, and a face that was not quite his own, because it was older and broader and laughing. Lily was beside him with Harry's eyes, the particular green that Hagrid had wept over in a ministry meeting room in July, the colour that people always mentioned, that Snape's gaze had stopped on in a potions classroom in September. They were smiling. Just that. Just standing there and smiling. Harry stood. He did not count the seconds. He stood until something grew heavy in his pocket, and he reached in and closed his hand around it, cold and real and small, the size of a large walnut, and pulled it out. The stone. He had wanted to find it. He hadn't wanted to use it. It had given itself to him accordingly. Behind him, from the shadows along the far wall, a voice said, "Well done." Quirrell stepped into the chamber's light. He was already reaching for the turban. He unwound it deliberately and turned around. At the back of Quirrell's head, where the back of a skull should have been, was a face. Pale as ash, flat-nosed, eyes red as something distilled down to its essential element over decades. It was a face Harry had spent 11 months reading about, in ministry case files, in Hermione's library research, in the description Amelia Bones had given him in a quiet voice in a meeting room in July. He knew what this face was. He had known since October which teacher made his scar hurt. "You killed my parents," Harry said. Not a question, not a revelation, an accusation made by someone who has had almost a year to understand precisely what had been taken from him, and who is making it now because this is the moment, and there may not be another one. "Kill him," Voldemort said. "He has it. Take it." Quirrell moved. His hands closed on Harry's wrists. Harry had spent a summer learning about his mother. He had heard Amelia Bones explain it to Dumbledore in the careful flat words of documentation. The enchantment responds to emotional reality. He had been told that Lily's choice was still present in him, in his skin, in the scar on his forehead. He did not flinch. Quirrell screamed. The hands blistered where they touched Harry, both of them at once, and Quirrell tried to pull back. Harry held on. He gripped Quirrell's wrists and didn't let go, because he understood what this was, and his mother had paid for it in full. "She gave this," he thought. "This is what she gave." Quirrell's body failed, not broken the way a person breaks, but coming undone at the seams of itself, consumed by the same thing that had been burning since contact. He fell. Voldemort's voice shrieked once, high and cold and furious, and then Quirrell was on the floor, and then he was gone. What remained moved through the chamber like a cold wind, without wind, dark, shapeless, purposeless, the particular purposelessness of something that has lost the body it was using. It moved toward Harry. He stood and let it, because there was nowhere to go and nothing to do with it, but stand. It passed through him, through his chest, through the scar. For a moment he understood something without words, hunger and loss, and the particular hatred of something distilled over decades into only what it wants and cannot have. Then it was gone. Harry thought. Hedwig has the letter. Amelia has the letter. Then his legs gave out, and the stone floor came up to meet him. And then nothing. The hospital wing had the quality of light that meant daylight through curtains. Soft, blurred at the edges, the kind of light that exists on the other side of something. Harry turned his head. Dumbledore was seated in the chair beside the bed. Half-moon spectacles, silver hair, the long beard that touched his robes. He looked very old. He looked as though he had been there for some time, and did not mind. Harry's voice came out rough. "You knew Quirrell might come?" "Yes," Dumbledore said. "You put the stone here to draw him out." A pause. "Yes. I believed that if he came for the stone, the threat would reveal itself. I did not intend for a student to face him. Is that all you're sorry for?" The pause that followed was the longest Harry had heard from a man who was not normally given to long pauses. Dumbledore's hands rested on his knees. He took his spectacles off and turned them once, slowly, and set them on his knee. He looked at Harry. He held that gaze for what felt like taking stock of something. He said, "No." The stone was gone. Dumbledore told him on the second morning in the hospital wing that the stone had been destroyed, that Nicholas Flamel and his wife had been informed, that they had enough elixir of life stockpiled to set their affairs in order, and then they would die. As they had intended to do eventually. As anyone who had lived for nearly 7 centuries had perhaps considered, in the quiet between years. Harry lay back and thought about this. He had prevented the stone from being stolen. The stone was now gone anyway, because keeping it in the world was more dangerous than not. He turned this over carefully and decided it was the right outcome. The stone's purpose had been to perpetuate a life indefinitely. But lives ended. That was what gave them the weight they had. Flamel had had nearly 700 years. He had chosen to end them, and the choice was his. Harry thought, "I understand that now. I understand it better than I would have in July." Dumbledore explained the rest of it the following afternoon, with his spectacles on his nose and his hands folded in his lap. What had happened in the underground chamber had a name: the Love Protection. It came from his mother's deliberate choice to place herself between Harry and the curse. Not accident, but choice. And that choice had left something in Harry that Quirrell's borrowed body could not touch without burning. He had known the broad mechanism since July. Amelia Bones had read it from Dumbledore's own letter in the conference room. But knowing the mechanism and understanding what it meant when it was in your hands were different things. His mother had died in October 1981 and left him with a protection so specific that a man could not close his hands on Harry's wrists without his skin acting on its own. The cost of that protection was Lily Potter's life, which had ended at 31 years old in a house in Godric's Hollow 11 years ago. Harry found it both wonderful and terrible. He thought this was probably the right response to something that was both. He did not try to resolve it into one or the other. He lay in the hospital wing and let it be what it was. Ron came on the third day with a chess set under one arm and the careful expression of someone who is uncertain what the right expression is for this situation. Hermione came with him. She sat down in the chair beside the bed and said, with visible effort at restraint, "Are you all right?" And then, evidently unable to stop herself, "What happened after we split up? I sent the owl for help, and then we heard you'd been—" "Are you?" "Later," Harry said. "Tell me later. Sit down." She sat. Ron set the chess pieces on the end of the bed. They played for an hour without speaking about any of it. Ron won, because Ron won at chess with the inevitability of someone to whom chess is a native language. Hermione lost in the way of someone who has never entirely accepted losing as a real outcome and is reconsidering it in real time. Harry lost because he had been in a hospital bed for 3 days and had faced something in an underground chamber and had not yet assembled the full picture of how he felt about it. None of them required him to explain anything in order to be there. Ron just set up the pieces. Hermione just sat. He had not known, before this year, that friendship could contain this. The end-of-year feast was the House Cup ceremony. Slytherin had won it for the 7th consecutive year, and the Slytherin table had the specific atmosphere of a house that has won things often enough to believe it is owed them, until Dumbledore stood at the front of the hall and awarded several last-minute points. 60 to Harry, 10 each to Ron and Hermione. And then, there are other qualities that merit recognition. I award 10 points to Neville Longbottom for showing the rare courage of standing up to one's friends. The hall's noise shifted when the totals came in. Gryffindor had overtaken Slytherin, and the noise that produced was considerable. Harry watched it from his seat without joining in, watching Neville receive the applause with the expression of someone who has not yet processed that it is for him. He thought about Frank and Alice Longbottom, permanent residents of the Janus Thicky ward at St. Mungo's. He thought about November 1981, Bellatrix Lestrange, and what it had cost Neville specifically. Frank and Alice Longbottom, permanent residents of the Janus Thicky ward. 2 boys in the same hall, 2 childhoods shaped by the same war, different costs. Harry joined in the applause. The Hogwarts Express left on the 1st of June. Harry found a compartment with Ron and Hermione, and Hedwig rode in her cage in the overhead rack, feet tucked up, eyes closed. The English countryside went past the window in the specific green of early summer. He had seen countryside before through windows he didn't control. The train to London, the rare times the Dursleys had driven somewhere, and he'd been allowed in the back seat. This window was his. He watched the fields go past and did not feel the need to look away. Ron fell asleep against the window by mid-morning. Hermione read something she'd borrowed from the Hogwarts library and had every intention of returning by owl. Harry watched the countryside and thought about Privet Drive, which was where this train was headed, eventually. The Ministry owl found them somewhere north of Birmingham, tapping at the compartment window, with the authority of an owl that knows exactly which carriage it wants. Harry opened the window. The owl extended its leg and waited while he untied the letter, then left without requiring acknowledgement, because the letter was formal correspondence and not a conversation. Amelia's handwriting. Neat, professional, each letter fully formed. The due process inquiry into the imprisonment of Sirius Orion Black has been formally opened at the Wizengamot level. An initial review date has been set for September. The inquiry is proceeding through the appropriate channels. I have not drawn conclusions, as the process is ongoing, and the evidence under review is incomplete. I thought you would want to know the inquiry has advanced. He read it twice. Ron was awake by then, reading over his shoulder. Hermione looked up from her book. Harry said, "There's a man in prison who might be my godfather. His name is Sirius Black. The DMLE is investigating whether he ever had a proper trial. He didn't, as far as anyone can establish. There's no Wizengamot record. He's been in Azkaban for 10 years. The compartment was quiet. Ron read the letter again, with the expression of someone checking that the words meant what he thought they meant. Hermione had already reached into her bag. She produced a quill and a piece of parchment, and looked at Harry with the specific expression of someone who is very close to asking whether she may begin taking notes. "Go ahead," Harry said. She began writing. Her quill moved fast. He almost laughed. Not quite yet. It was still too much to carry. But the shape of it was there. His friends, and the chess set, and the notes, and the letter in his hand from the person who had opened the inquiry. The train went south. He had known Privet Drive was at the end of this journey. The DMLE agreement was clear on the point. The blood protection was clear on the point. Harry was not someone who misunderstood the terms of arrangements now. He would go back to Privet Drive. He would call it home. Not because the Dursleys had earned it. They hadn't, not the part that mattered. But home did not require warmth. Home could be a place with a specific charge attached to it, a place you returned to, because the returning meant something beyond the place itself. His mother had died in October 1981, so that he could be here now. 11 years old on a train heading south, with an owl asleep in the overhead rack, and 2 people beside him who had gone into an underground chamber and trusted him to go the rest of the way alone. She had made a choice. The choice had a cost. He understood the cost in the full specific weight of it now, not as a fact he had been told and filed, but as a thing he had felt in his hands in a chamber under the school in May, when he held on and did not let go. He would call it home. The choice was his, and he would make it, and the enchantment would respond to emotional reality, because the emotional reality was real, gratitude and grief, and a year of learning what it meant to have people in his corner. The green fields went past the window. He was the boy from the cupboard. He would always be that, somewhere in the part of himself that didn't dissolve when the circumstances changed. It had marked him, the way the scar marked him, the way 10 years left their specific shape in the person they made. Still that. And also, on a June afternoon, on a train going south, with his friends beside him and Amelia's letter in his pocket,